Welcome into the Quest Number 9 podcast. My name is Seth Warner. And today on the Quest Number 9 podcast, I'm going to be talking about Kentucky basketball from a fan's perspective. On this episode, we're going to be talking about Kentucky finishing summer practices up almost a week ago and give our overall takeaways. Talk about Mobile Atkenin, a reclass candidate in the 2027 class that reclassed to 2026. Was one of the top players in the 2027 class, and how that transition affects Kentucky. Rippy Jr., who we talked about, I don't think I've been on here since he ended up having to cancel his visit at the beginning of the month. So he has rescheduled his visit for October 1st to the 3rd. Also, Anthony Thompson, another guy we've talked about, really talented, really impressed on the Adidas circuit at the 3SSB, scheduled his visit for Kentucky coming up September 24th, and how the new agreement with them will affect Kentucky going forward into this new era of Kentucky basketball where we have rev share and all these different influences. The first thing we'll talk about is Kentucky finishing up practices and how our really takeaways after a week out, from almost a week out. Kentucky was able to wrap up their practices last Thursday, and we've talked about some of our really big takeaways. Colin Chandler was hurt, we've talked about, but that last couple of weeks, he was really starting to ramp up. Nothing too impressive from him, but was overall just a really strong performance. Otega Owe at a camp like a week or so ago rolled his ankle or anything. Nothing major. Just he was in a boot at one point. Him and Jaden Quaintance were at a park for the Lexington at the Dirt Bowl, so everybody saw them out there and were a little bit nervous. But Quaintance looked good moving. He's dunking the ball. Everybody wasn't super pumped with him dunking the ball while in slides, but overall, it's been a really good summer workouts with a lot of guys really making leaps. Malachi Moreno, a guy that just really shows his consistency, a guy that can do a little bit of everything well and doesn't have those hills and valleys like Brandon Garrison or some of these other guys that really have question marks, like a Jasper Johnson with some of his physicality, Braden Hawthorne, just a bunch of different guys on this roster that have some question marks. But Kentucky, we know going forward, we have a really good core of guys that have really established themselves in Otega Owe, Jalen Lowe. Cam Williams is going to be a solid piece, I feel like, coming off the bench. And then Mo Diabate with his physicality, motor. Denzel Aberdeen. A lot of these guys have, I feel like, have really, really high floors as impact pieces for Kentucky going into next season. It'll be interesting to see how Kentucky does going into the fall. We'll see if everyone can stay healthy and really be able to pick off where they stopped at the end of this past season. So with Kentucky, I think overall this summer has been really good. We still have a lot of questions with different players. We talked about that last episode. Just a final outlook on these practices. Kentucky was able to really emphasize some of the fundamentals of how Kentucky's going to play this year. Another thing was Baba Adebanton reclassifying from the 2027 class, 2026 class. He's a guy that Kentucky was the only offer, or in the first offer that Kentucky gave for the 2027 class. Is still going to be a target for Kentucky going into this 2026 cycle. So Kentucky's going to be aggressive going forward in this 2026 class as things really ramp up in commitments in the early September, October. There's usually a handful of guys at least that commit during that time, that usually a few of them end up at Kentucky to keep up with that. And also Rippy Jr., he rescheduled his visit, so that's positive news after he had to cancel his visit due to weather. It was supposed to be on his birthday weekend, but due to weather, like I said, ended up having to be canceled. But all over social media, you saw the different coaches and different players wishing him a happy birthday. I thought that was really cool and could be really impactful just to him seeing people reach out even though he's not even there. Also, Anthony Thompson, like I said, scheduled his visit for September 24th that weekend. So we'll see. We'll see how his recruitment keeps on going. Kentucky's in his, I'm pretty sure, top 10. So we'll see how Kentucky is really able to get into his recruitment. Like I said, one of the most talented players in this 2026 elite movement, elite wingspan, not the most explosive guy in the world, but just understands how to use his body and just do different things on the floor. If you want to go back a couple episodes, we have a good breakdown about that and about him. So overall, Kentucky's really being able to schedule some of these visits and really being able to get momentum going into this 2026 recruiting cycle. And also, Kentucky was able to finish up their schedule, just to give you a couple snippets of what that's going to look like since it's now completely put together, with the season starting off with Purdue and Georgetown as our two preseason games. It'd be interesting to see how Kentucky comes out early with Jaden Quaintance potentially not playing. And that U of L game, that's always really important. We're going on the road this year to KFC Yum Center, and it's really early this year, being on November 11th. So we'll see how Kentucky does, being able to go on the road and see if they can beat a good U of L team that has some similar, quite a bit of turnover compared to Kentucky. CBS Sport Classic also is always a big momentum game. We're going against Michigan State, not the most talented Michigan State team, but always physical. We're going to push Kentucky to their limits with physicality. That's something this team's going to be really good at. So we'll see how they play and really are able to perform. Also, Kentucky has a really tough, like a little over a month stretch that I think is going to be really important for the Cats as they get into December and early January, as Kentucky's going to be playing North Carolina, Gonzaga, Indiana, St. John's, and then Alabama on the road, all in a little over a month stretch. So to me, that's the most important stretch of the season as Kentucky gets into early SEC play and are able to establish their rhythm and dominance. And I think that will change if Kentucky ends up being a 4-loss team or a 7-loss team or 9-loss team. I think that big stretch will really decide, as SEC not being as good this year compared to last year, having a lot of graduates. It'll be interesting to see really how this pecking order of the SEC ends up forming out. We know Florida's really good and some of these other really talented teams. And also, Kentucky finishes probably their biggest matchup of SEC play. It's going to finish the season, especially when you look preseason, is at home against Florida to finish up the regular season. Typically, we always went to Florida to end the year, but this year we're going to end up hosting Florida. So that'll be really cool to see how Kentucky, going against one of the top teams in the country, to really be able to close out this 2025-2026 season. And I was going to talk about, they agreed to a new deal with Kentucky yesterday, and just explaining more what that is and how it's going to impact Kentucky going forward and how it changes some of the NIL and rev share. And with the rev share, what it is we've talked about it. It's the 25 point some, the 25 million or whatever that is allowed by the NCAA for the schools to directly pay the players. And what this is the rev share, and it goes for all athletics. So Kentucky this year is going to have is now signed to, it was a 15-year deal with JMI. JMI already has some branding stuff and different stuff with the University of Kentucky. But what they're going to do is they're basically privatizing and signing the collective to JMI. Now JMI is now They're getting rid of Club Blue. It was Kentucky's collective, and it's basically all coming into one with collective and with their rev share. So it'll be interesting to see how Kentucky works that stuff out. JMI, for schools are starting to do this a little bit more, but the other schools that JMI works really closely with their media rights and different things like this is Notre Dame and UCLA. And those two teams, they help with their collective. What they're going to be doing is they're going to be kind of a GM perspective. Like Kentucky coaches will pick their players, but JMI will be negotiating their contracts. And if the coaching staff says somebody's worth $1 million and the player wants 1.2 or 2 million, JMI will negotiate if the player still wants to come here or figure out how they're going to be able to make him happy, basically. And like I was saying with those two other schools, they do some of that stuff for those schools and do most of their local media stuff. But what's different with those two schools is they're both keeping their collectives as their own entity. Because right now, collectives they're their own entities themselves. They're not supposed to work with the university, but they do. These schools are keeping kind of a plan B. It'll be interesting to see how things ramp up. Kentucky will have plenty of money coming out of this contract, so there won't be any issues with that. It's a $30+ million a year contract for like 15 years. It was interesting to see how long it was, because with how things keep on changing in college basketball, I was surprised how willing the University of Kentucky was to just be tied up to this one entity for so long with such a high guaranteed amount of money. But I thought that was just interesting. And overall, it'll be interesting to see how the landscape keeps on changing and if this works out for Kentucky with JMI. JMI, what I've kind of learned of them over the last little bit is like they still do Kentucky media before this, local media, and they weren't known as the most like media friendly, I would say, and not the most modern when it comes to Kentucky stuff and just all that. It'll be interesting to see how they all just adjust and going forward, how they're going to be able to keep up with some of these other organizations that are also doing these contracts and recruiting these players. And that's all from the Quest Number 9 podcast. Please like and subscribe. You can go find me at Quest Number 9 on Instagram and Twitter. And I will see you next time.